An entire generation of human beings lived and died without ever once seeing the sun. They were born into cold and darkness, raised their children by the light of desperate fires, and drew their last breath without a single morning sky ever appearing above them. Not one pale dawn, not one blue afternoon, not one ray of ordinary light. That was the long night. The longest winter the world of Westeros has ever endured. And it is from that terrible consuming darkness that everything you are about to learn tonight was ultimately born. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Notice the weight of your body against the surface beneath you, the warmth of the air around you, the way the room has settled into its own particular quiet. Whatever the day carried, the obligations, the unfinished thoughts, the small and persistent worries that follow you into the evening, let all of it begin to loosen now, slowly, the way a fist opens when sleep begins to arrive. You do not need to hold on to any of it. There is nowhere you need to be in this moment. The night is long, and it belongs entirely to you, and the only direction we are traveling tonight is backward, deep backward, into the oldest layers of a history that most people have forgotten exists. Let your breathing find a natural rhythm. In through the nose, long and slow, and out through the mouth, releasing whatever small tensions the breath has gathered. With each exhale, let the present day become a little more distant. The particular arrangement of concerns that constitutes your waking life is very new, in the scale of what we are going to explore tonight. We are going somewhere far older than any of that. We are going to the beginning of the world as Westeros knows it, 12,000 years back, to the age before kingdoms, before iron, before the wall that stands 700 feet high at the top of the world. Let the quiet carry you there. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. Before there was anything resembling a kingdom in Westeros, before castles, before hereditary rule, before the very concept of a border had been traced in any soil, this continent belonged for uncountable ages to beings who are not human, the children of the forest. The name carries a gentleness that can make it easy to underestimate what these beings actually were. They were ancient, not individually, in the way that a very old person is ancient, but collectively, the way a river is ancient. Their relationship to time itself was fundamentally different from any human relationship to time. They did not race through their years. They moved through the centuries the way stone moves through geological pressure, slowly and with enormous force. They were small, these children, slight and dark-eyed, with features that the few surviving descriptions compare to both children and very old people simultaneously, as though they had somehow compressed and exceeded a human lifespan into a form that suggested both beginnings and endings at once. Their voices, legend says, were like the rustling of leaves or the sound of a stream running over smooth stones, not unpleasant, not quite music, but something that occupied the same register as natural sound rather than speech. They moved through their vast forests with an ease that implied genuine belonging, not the careful navigation of a visitor, but the unconscious confidence of someone moving through their own home. The forests were immense, not simply large by any human measure, but genuinely vast in the way that suggests a landscape that has never been logged, never been cleared, never felt the weight of a human ambition press against it. Weirwood trees stood everywhere, not the scattered, isolated sentinels that survive into the main story, but entire landscapes of pale bark and red-black leaves stretching from the shores of the summer sea all the way to the frozen edge of the world in the far north, the God's Eye with its Isle of Faces, the deep still woodlands of the north, the river valleys of the Trident, the coastal cliffs of the west, all of it draped in the same ancient watching silence that is the signature of a world that has not yet been interrupted. The weirwood trees were not simply where the children lived. They were something closer to what the children were, an extension of their consciousness, a mechanism of their memory, a conduit for the particular form of awareness that the green seers among them possessed. The carved faces on the trunks were not decorative. They were functional, windows between the mortal world and whatever it is the green seers perceived when they sank their consciousness into the root network that connected every pale grove on the continent into a single living organism of almost incomprehensible age. The sap that ran from those faces was the colour of old blood, and it ran slowly, with a kind of deliberateness that made it feel less like a biological process and more like a message. The green seers were the most revered individuals in children's society, marked from birth, rare even among their own people, capable of sending their awareness through the root network to see across distances that no physical body could traverse. Through the weirwoods, they could watch events unfolding on the other side of the continent. They could peer into the past and see moments preserved in the wood, like insects preserved in amber. They were the forest's memory, the forest's long eyes. And for tens of thousands of years, those eyes watched a continent empty of human beings, and the watching was undisturbed, and the silence was whole. Then the first men came. They arrived across the Arm of Dorne, which in those ancient days was not a chain of stepping-stone islands, but a full causeway of land connecting Essos to the southernmost tip of Westeros. They came not as an organized army with a general and a plan of conquest, but as something harder to resist than any army. They came as ordinary people, families, migrants spilling westward across a land bridge, moving for all the ancient human reasons, the pressure of populations behind them, the promise of land ahead, the simple, irresistible pull of an open horizon. They brought bronze tools and bronze weapons, and when they found the forests in their way, they cut them down. The sound of bronze axes on weirwood trunks must have been devastating to the children, not necessarily to the ears, but to that collective sense, that awareness distributed through the root network, the way you might feel it if someone began methodically dismantling the walls of your home. The children fought back, with their green seers sending floods and storms and animals against the invaders, with their wargs inhabiting the bodies of wolves and bears and whatever other creatures they could find. With the sheer deep-rooted power of beings who had been part of this land for so long that the distinction between themselves and it had become blurry and profound. And the war lasted 4,000 years. It is worth pausing on that number, truly sitting with it, rather than letting it slide past the way large numbers tend to slide past, when they exceed our ability to personally imagine them. 4,000 years. The entirety of recorded human history, from the first writing pressed into clay in ancient Mesopotamia to this present night, spans roughly 5,000 years. The war between the children of the forest and the first men lasted 4/5 of that span. Every human generation that lived in Westeros during those 4,000 years was born into a world at war. Parents who had never known peace raised children who would never know it either. The conflict was so old, so continuous, that it became simply the condition of existence, the background radiation of a world at odds with itself. Neither side won. Neither side could win, perhaps, because the two sides were not fighting over the same thing. Not really. The first men fought for the right to transform the land into something that could sustain their immediate needs. The children fought to preserve a world in which consciousness and memory were distributed through living systems that belonged to no individual. These are not compatible positions. You cannot half-cut a weirwood. And so the war ground on, generation after generation, wearing both sides down in ways that victories and defeats could not fully describe, until finally both peoples arrived at the same exhausted conclusion. They would have to share the world, and they would have to decide how. The pact was made on the Isle of Faces, in the center of the God's Eye Lake, the most sacred place in Westeros, where the oldest weirwoods in the world stand so close together that the interior of the isle is dim even at noon, lit only by the red filtered light through the canopy above. Picture the journey to that place. The open water of the God's Eye, vast and still, the shoreline of the mainland shrinking behind the boats carrying the representatives of both peoples, the isle growing slowly larger ahead of them, small, green, absolutely dense, with pale trees and watching faces. There would have been no wind. That is how the imagination insists on this scene. Absolute stillness, and the sound of oars in dark water. The terms of the pact were simple and consequential. The first men would keep the open lands, the coastlines, the plains, the river valleys where their farms were already taking root. The children would keep the deep forests. The first men would never again put an axe to a weirwood tree. And to seal this agreement, to make it witnessed and therefore binding in a way that extended beyond any human life or any human memory, the faces were carved. Thousands of faces pressed into the pale bark of thousands of trunks across the isle, and eventually across every weirwood grove in the continent. Every carved face was a witness. Every witness was connected through the root network to every other witness. The pact was built into the forest itself. What the first men received in return went beyond territorial rights. They received the gods. The old gods, the nameless, wordless presences behind the weirwood faces, became the first men's gods too, within the span of generations. The people who had crossed the Arm of Dorne with whatever spiritual traditions they had carried from Essos gradually set those traditions aside and turned instead to the faces in the trees. Perhaps because the faces were undeniably present, undeniably watching, undeniably real in a way that abstract beliefs rarely achieve. Or perhaps because a people who have fought for 4,000 years and finally made peace need to worship something that can witness the fact of that peace and hold it in its memory. Whatever the reason, the weirwood faces became the faces of the gods. And the first men became, in this quiet way, children of the forest in their own manner. The green men were placed on the Isle of Faces to tend the sacred weirwoods and maintain the spirit of what had been agreed. They are among the most mysterious figures in all of Westerosi lore, tall and antlered, neither entirely human nor entirely not, worshippers of the old gods with a devotion that makes ordinary piety seem like a polite habit. They are said to still be there, on that small island in the middle of that great lake, tending trees that have been old since before the pact was signed. Howland Reed visited the Isle of Faces before the main story begins, in the years before the rebellion that would eventually shake the world. He came back changed. What he learned there, what the green men taught him or showed him, has shaped everything he has done since, including secrets he has kept so carefully that even his children do not know all of them. when Bran Stark sits in his wheelchair in the Godswood of Winterfell, closes his eyes, and lets his consciousness drift into the roots of the ancient weirwood there, he is reaching into the same network that the Pact created, or rather, that the Pact consecrated, since the network had always existed, long before any treaty. He can see through the eyes of carved faces in other places. He can look into the past and find moments preserved in the wood as clearly as if they were happening now. The Weirwood Network is, at its heart, a library, the oldest library in the world. And the Pact was the moment when the first men, by agreeing never again to cut these trees, became part of its archive. Daenerys Targaryen, standing in the cave beneath Dragonstone, looking at the spiral carvings left by the children thousands of years before her people arrived in Westeros, is touching the edge of this ancient world. Her bloodline in Westeros is barely 300 years old. She is a newcomer looking at a history older than her civilization by more than 11,000 years. And the carvings are telling her something she does not yet fully understand. That the thing she is preparing to fight is not new, not unique to her moment, and not something that fire alone has ever been able to permanently resolve. The wall in the cave painting is not a suggestion, it is a precedent. Jon Snow, standing beside her in that cave, is something else again. Through his Stark blood, he is a descendant of the first men who made the Pact on the Isle of Faces. The faces carved into the weirwoods of his family's Godswood are the direct legacy of that agreement, the agreement that ended 4,000 years of war, and gave both peoples, however uneasily, a world they could share. Jon has already seen what lies beyond the wall. He has already touched the oldest terror in the world's history with his own hands. What he is looking at in that cave is not abstract history. It is the operating instructions for the crisis he has been living inside since the first episode of the story. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. Let the image of the weirwood forest settle over you now. Pale trees and red leaves, the slow red sap running down carved faces that have been watching since before memory began. You do not need to carry any of this carefully. You only need to let it rest in you. The way roots rest in earth, not grasped at, not organized, just present, settling into the deep places where the things that last tend to live. The children of the forest watched for 12,000 years. The faces they carved watched with them. And something of that watching is preserved in every story that has come down to us out of that ancient time. Your breathing is slower now. The day is very far away. You are resting in something much older than any of your concerns, any of your borders, any of the certainties that organize your waking hours. The first forest of Westeros is all around you tonight, vast and pale and silent and still watching. You do not need to do anything with that. You only need to sleep. The history will keep. The roots will hold. And for now, let the oldest night in the world carry you gently into the rest you came here for. But the peace the Pact had bought was not meant to last forever. And something older and colder than any of these ancient kingdoms was already stirring in the frozen north. A hunger that no treaty and no carved face and no weirwood memory could satisfy. A darkness preparing to swallow the world whole. You are still drifting backward through time. The pace is gentle, unhurried, the way the pace of anything truly ancient tends to be. History does not rush. It accumulates. Let your body remain heavy and warm where you are. Let your thoughts continue to thin and soften at the edges. We are moving deeper into the past now. past the signing of the Pact, into the age that followed it, the long, complicated, astonishing era that later storytellers would call the Age of Heroes, partly because it produced figures of extraordinary scale, and partly because it ended in the kind of disaster that requires heroes to survive. The Pact changed the world of Westeros in ways that took centuries to fully manifest. It did not resolve the deep differences between the first men and the children of the forest. 4,000 years of war leaves marks on a culture that no single treaty can erase. But it established a new condition, a kind of negotiated reality in which both peoples could exist in proximity without constant violence. And one of the quieter consequences of that negotiation was something that would shape Westeros' spiritual life for all the thousands of years to follow. The first men began to worship the old gods. They looked at the weirwood faces, carved and watching, running with their slow red sap, and they recognized in those faces something they chose to call divine. This adoption of the old gods is one of the most understated and consequential moments in Westerosi history. The first men arrived in Westeros with whatever spiritual traditions they had carried from Essos, traditions the story never quite specifies, but which presumably did not center on pale trees and carved wooden faces. Yet within the span of a few centuries following the Pact, those original traditions had been largely set aside. The new gods were the old gods. The new prayers were offered to faces in weirwood bark. What does it say about the power of the children's sacred technology that the people who had spent 4,000 years cutting it down eventually adopted it as their own? Perhaps the weirwood faces, genuinely watching and genuinely present in ways that abstract beliefs are not, simply overwhelmed whatever the first men had believed before. The age that followed the Pact is called the Age of Heroes, and the name is accurate in some ways and misleading in others. It was an age of great figures, of men and women whose deeds were large enough that 12,000 years of subsequent history has not been able to entirely wear them away. But it was also an age of genuine darkness and difficulty. A world still finding its shape, peoples and communities working out what it meant to live in this vast and magically saturated continent, learning the rhythms of its impossible winters and its brief, blazing summers, learning to read the land's old warnings and the older warnings beyond the wall. The heroes were great precisely because the age required them to be. The first men were never a single unified people, and they never became one. They were 100 different groups, clans, tribes, extended family networks, that happened to have crossed the same land bridge within roughly the same few centuries, and found themselves sharing the same vast territory. Over the generations following the Pact, these groups began to sort themselves into something resembling kingdoms, not formal monarchies with written law and bureaucratic structure, but clusters of people organized around powerful bloodlines, shared geography, and the particular challenges of the landscape they had settled. The North went to the people who could survive the cold and understood it. The Reach went to those who understood how to make the land yield abundance. The coast of what would one day be the Iron Islands went to those who understood the sea and what the sea demanded. 12 kingdoms is the number that later historians apply to this era, though the actual count shifted constantly as alliances formed, wars were fought, and families died out or were absorbed into larger ones. It was not a stable political landscape in any modern sense. It was more like a living ecosystem of power, constantly reorganizing itself in response to internal pressure and external threat. The North, perhaps, was the most stable of these 12, partially because of its geography, which made it naturally defensible against both human enemies and the wilder things that roamed the deep cold, and partially because the people who ruled in the north were already aware of the Wall and what it meant, already living in the specific shadow of that ancient barrier and the specific responsibility it implied. The first men of the Age of Heroes were not the armoured, sword-wielding warriors of a later, more romanticized era. They were farmers, fishermen, herders and hunters who happened to live in a world where the distinction between the natural and the supernatural had not yet been clearly drawn, because in that world it did not exist. Magic was not remarkable to them. It was simply part of the world's fabric, as accepted, as unremarked as the changing of seasons or the rising of the moon. When a warg among the first men sent his consciousness into the body of a wolf, it was not a miracle. When a greenseer sat before a weirwood face and looked backward through the root network into the past, it was simply something that greenseers did. This matters enormously when we try to understand the Age of Heroes, because it means that the legends of this era, stories that seem fantastical to later, more skeptical generations, may be preserving something closer to literal truth than those later generations would credit. When the legends say that Garth Greenhand could make crops grow from barren soil, they may be describing a greenseer of extraordinary power who could commune with the earth in ways we no longer fully understand. When they say that the Grey King ruled the sea for 1,000 years, they may be describing a warg of unprecedented ability who spent his life in the bodies of sea creatures. The magic was real. The people were real. The stories are the residue of real events filtered through 12,000 years of retelling. Garth Greenhand is perhaps the most ancient figure the Age of Heroes produced. Some scholars place him before the Pact itself, which would make him genuinely prehistoric in Westerosi terms. He is depicted wearing a crown of vines and flowers, his hands perpetually green as if stained by the earth itself, and he is credited with teaching the first men to farm the land of Westeros, with being the first true king to rule the Reach, and perhaps the first king to rule at all. Every great house in the south can trace some thread of lineage back to Garth, or one of his many children, who scattered across the continent and planted the seeds of what would eventually become the great dynasties. He is a figure of abundance and deep-rootedness, of the particular wisdom that comes from understanding the relationship between a people and their soil. Brandon of the Bloody Blade was a different kind of figure, a warrior, not a tender. The legends credit him with driving the giants from the land south of the Wall, with great victories against the others during the long night, with clearing the way for human habitation. In regions that had been uninhabitable before him, the Bloody Blade was presumably stained with more blood than any legend can politely account for. But the name has survived because the deed was large enough to carry it. He was the kind of figure who in a later age might be called a conqueror or a destroyer, but in his own time was understood as the force that made the space for everything that followed. Not all heroism is gentle. It is worth pausing here in the slow drift of this telling to notice something important about how we receive these stories. We know the Age of Heroes entirely through layers of later interpretation, through the maesters who approached magic with deep skepticism and sometimes erased what they did not understand, through the singers who loved the grandeur of these tales so much that they inflated and embellished, until the human scale of the real events was lost beneath the legendary one, and through the family traditions of the great houses, whose pride required their ancestors to have been grander and nobler than the actual evidence could always support. What survives is not the age itself, but the impression it left. The shape of a hand pressed into wet clay, now hardened into stone, the hand long gone, but its form preserved. This is not a reason to dismiss the legends. It is a reason to read them differently, not as historical records, but as emotional and psychological ones. What the stories of the Age of Heroes preserve is not always what happened, but what the people of subsequent ages needed to believe had happened. They needed to believe in a Garth who could feed nations with his green hands. They needed a Brandon who could drive back the giants and the cold. They needed a Bran who could build a wall between the world and everything that sought to end it. These are not simply stories about individual people. They are stories about what an entire civilization believed it was capable of, had been capable of, might need to be capable of again. The Fisher Queen is one of the most fragmentary figures in all of Westerosi legend. She appears in the traditions of several different coastal peoples, always as a woman of extraordinary authority, who ruled from a ship or an island rather than a castle, whose power came from the sea rather than from the land. Some scholars think she represents an actual historical figure, a queen of the coastal peoples whose real deeds were influential enough to survive in the cultural memory of multiple groups simultaneously. Others think she is a composite, several women whose stories became braided together over the centuries until they were indistinguishable. What is consistent across every version is the image of a woman at a prow, looking outward at open water, with a kind of authority that requires no explanation and no sword. Serwyn of the Mirror Shield is another kind of figure entirely, more purely martial, a warrior whose legend the great lords of a later age would use as a template for what they imagined knights to be, even though knighthood in the Andal sense did not exist in his time. He killed the dragon Urax by creeping up on it while it studied its own reflection in his polished shield, fascinated by what it saw. He freed Princess Derissa from some unnamed captor. He did the things that heroes in this age were expected to do, confronted the large and dangerous things, and found ways past them that brute force alone could not provide. The mirror shield is the key detail. Serwyn defeated his greatest enemy by making that enemy look at itself. When Tywin Lannister, in the present-day story, speaks with such fierce certainty about the importance of the Lannister name, he is invoking something that traces back to Lann the Clever, who supposedly stole Casterly Rock from the Casterly family through cunning alone, using tricks and misdirection, and whatever combination of wit and audacity eventually convinced the Casterlys that the fortress had always been his. The gold in the Lannister mines, the lion on their banner, the absolute conviction that the name alone commands respect. All of these have their roots in a story from the Age of Heroes about a man who took a rock full of gold and decided that it and everything it represented would define his bloodline forever. Tywin would have recognized Lann the Clever immediately. He would have called him a realist when Robb Stark was declared king in the north by his bannermen in the Great Hall of Winterfell. They were enacting something whose roots ran 12,000 years deep. The title king in the north was not invented during the Targaryen period. It was one of the original 12 kingdoms of the Age of Heroes, the oldest continuous political tradition in Westeros. When the men of the North rose to their feet and called Robb their king, they were not simply rebelling against the Iron Throne. They were, in some deep and not entirely conscious way, remembering who they had been before there was an Iron Throne, Before there was a unified Westeros, before any conqueror had ever thought to bring all 7 kingdoms under a single rule, the North remembers. That phrase is not rhetoric, it is archaeology. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. And Stannis Baratheon, with his absolute and inflexible belief in the primacy of legitimate claim, is in many ways the most purely traditional figure in the main story. A man whose conviction that the law is the law and the claim is the claim would have been entirely correct in the Age of Heroes, when legitimacy was the only thing that distinguished a king from a warlord. Stannis is right, by the rules of the world as it existed in that ancient age. The tragedy is that the world moved around him without his noticing, and he never quite forgave it for doing so. The kingdoms of the Age of Heroes are sleeping now, not gone, not fully gone, but resting under the accumulated weight of everything that came after them. Their names persist in housewords and castle names, and the particular way the people of each region carry themselves, hold themselves, define themselves against the rest. You can hear the Age of Heroes in the way a northerner speaks of winter, not as a hardship but as a fact of life, a defining reality to be prepared for and respected. You can hear it in the way an Ironborn speaks of the sea, not as a backdrop, but as a sovereign, the first and truest ruler of everything that matters. The oldest stories are always the ones that got into the bones, and they do not leave simply because the age that made them has passed. Let the 12 kingdoms settle around you now, their stone towers and their weirwood groves and their vast cold skies. There is nothing you need to carry from this era into tomorrow. You only need to rest here for a moment, in the oldest layer of a world that is still in its deepest places, the world the first men made. Your breathing has found its own slow rhythm. The concerns of your day have grown very distant. You are resting in something much larger than your own moment, and that is exactly where you are meant to be tonight. The long night did not announce itself. It arrived the way the worst things always do, gradually and then all at once, swallowing a world of kingdoms and heroes in a cold so profound that it would leave scars on the human soul 12,000 years later, on the very night you are resting now. Something changed. The change came first as cold, a cold that was different from any winter the first men had yet experienced in Westeros. Every culture has its ordinary cold, the kind that comes predictably in the turning of seasons, that people have adapted to and built their lives around. This was not that cold. This cold had a quality to it that the survivors would later struggle to describe accurately, a quality that suggested intention, as though the temperature were not falling but being lowered, deliberately, by something that wanted the world to be that way. The animals felt it first, the birds went quiet, the wolves moved south in numbers that had never been seen before. And then the darkness came, and it did not leave. Let your body remain heavy and still. What we are moving through now is the darkest chapter in the history of Westeros. And I want you to move through it gently, the way you move through deep water, not fighting the current, just drifting with it, feeling the temperature around you, staying oriented by the faint light of the surface above. You are warm, you are safe. The long night ended 12,000 years ago, but it left marks on the world that are still visible if you know where to look. And tonight we are going to look at them together, slowly, in the way that difficult things can sometimes be approached when the body is at rest and the mind is soft. The long night lasted a generation, According to the oldest legends, not a season, not a year, a human generation, long enough for children to be born into the darkness and grow into adults who had never once seen the sky brighten into morning. We do not know precisely how many years this represents. The word generation is the unit the legends use, and that unit resists precise translation. 20 years? 30? The uncertainty itself is telling. It suggests a duration so complete, so total, that the people living through it lost their ordinary relationship to time. When you cannot measure a winter by the return of summer, when summer simply does not return, time begins to collapse into the single undifferentiated fact of the darkness itself. The cold came first, as I said, and then the darkness followed. The two were related but not identical. The darkness was not simply the absence of the sun in the way that night is the absence of the sun. The darkness of the long night had a texture to it, a weight, a presence that the surviving stories struggle to describe without resorting to personification. The darkness pressed down. The darkness had hunger. Whether this was literal, whether the supernatural cold and dark were being projected by the others, the White Walkers, who moved within it, or whether it was the failing of human perception under conditions of extreme stress and cold, the stories cannot fully distinguish. But the darkness was experienced as a presence, not merely an absence. That distinction matters. The others, whom the people south of the Wall would eventually come to call the White Walkers, are creatures for whom the cold and dark were not merely hospitable conditions, but something closer to their natural element. They came from the lands of always winter, the frozen regions at the top of the world where the cold was permanent and the dark was normal and ordinary life as any southern culture understood it did not and could not exist. They moved through the long night as though they had been waiting for it, as though the deep winter that settled over Westeros was not a disaster that had befallen them, but an invitation they had been expecting. They brought their dead with them, or rather, they raised the dead from wherever they found them, and brought them marching southward in armies that did not need to be fed or rested or kept warm. It is worth sitting with the specific horror of that for a moment before we continue. The horror of an enemy that uses your own dead against you. Every person the long night killed became, in the logic of the others, a potential soldier. The more effective the darkness and cold were at killing, the stronger the army of the dead became. This was not warfare in any sense the first men had understood before. It was closer to erasure, a process by which the living world was systematically converted into the undead world, one body at a time, the boundary between life and death, being pushed relentlessly southward like the edge of a glacier, moving in slow motion toward everything that remained alive. Against this, the first men fought with fire. Fire was the one thing that the cold could not simply absorb. Fire was the one thing the whites could not approach without their bodies being consumed. Fire was the one thing that the others themselves seemed to respect, in the way that an enemy respects a weapon that can actually hurt them. The sacred fires that burned in the settlements of the first men during the long night were not merely practical heat sources. They were the visible assertion that life was still here, still refusing to yield, still capable of generating its own light in opposition to the dark that wanted to claim everything. The cultural obsession with fire that persists in Westeros to this day, in the Lord of Light religion, in the special reverence given to flames, in the almost theological weight that fire carries in the metaphors of the story. All of this has its roots in the long night. These are the remnants of a trauma so vast that it embedded itself in the spiritual DNA of an entire civilization. Azor Ahai emerged from this darkness, or so the legends of the Lord of Light tradition say. He is described as a warrior of tremendous skill and conviction, who was chosen, or chose himself, to forge a weapon that could stand against the darkness in a way that no ordinary sword could. The weapon was called Lightbringer, and the forging of it was one of the great acts of sacrifice in any mythology attached to Westeros. 3 attempts were required. The first failed when the blade was quenched in water and shattered. The second failed when it was driven into the heart of a lion and broke again. The third succeeded in a manner so terrible that it changed the nature of what heroism means in this world forever. On the third attempt, Azor Ahai called his wife to him. Her name was Nissa. The legends describe her as beloved by him, not merely as a possession or an ally, but genuinely loved, in the way that makes the subsequent act all the more devastating. He plunged the sword he had been laboring over for 30 days into her heart. And when he did, her soul poured into the blade. The fires of her love and her grief and her willingness, whether that willingness was truly given we cannot know, the fires of everything she was became the fire of Lightbringer. And Lightbringer burned. It burned with a light that was not quite ordinary fire, a light that the darkness could not absorb, a light that cut through the cold the way a hot blade cuts through ice. The weapon that ended the long night was forged from a love that was sacrificed to make it possible. We should sit with that for a long moment before moving on. We should sit with what it means that the central heroic myth of the Lord of Light tradition, the myth that underlies Melisandre's entire theology, that shapes the prophecy of the prince who was promised, that will echo through everything that happens in the main story, is a story about a man who killed the person he loved most, because he believed it was the only way to save the world. Not a villain doing this. A hero, the chosen hero, the one who was supposed to be right. The story does not present Azor Ahai as a monster. It presents him as a man who faced an impossible choice and made it, and the world was saved, and the cost was everything. What does it say about the long night? That the best story the survivors could find to explain their salvation was this one. The last hero is another figure from this era, possibly a different tradition describing the same events, possibly a genuinely different person. One of a group of heroes who worked in concert to end the long night while Azor Ahai was doing what he was doing. The last hero travelled into the frozen north alone, or nearly alone, seeking the children of the forest and their ancient knowledge, their green sight, their connection to the deepest roots of the world. His companions died along the journey, one by one, until he was alone with a broken sword and a dying horse, and the certainty that the children were somewhere ahead in the darkness, if he could only reach them. The legend does not specify what the children gave him, but the long night ended. The others retreated. The cold began slowly to yield. The long night left marks on Westeros that 12,000 years have not erased. The most visible mark is the wall, but we will come to the wall and its builder in their own time. The subtler marks are in the culture itself, in the way that every fire lit in Westeros carries a special quality of comfort that goes beyond the merely physical, because in the cells of every descendant of the first men, there is something that remembers a time when fire was the only thing between life and the dark. In the way that long winters are feared with an intensity that seems disproportionate to their practical inconvenience. In the way that the phrase winter is coming carries the specific gravity it carries in Stark culture, not as a statement about seasonal weather, but as the oldest warning in the world. Melisandre believes that Azor Ahai will be reborn, that the long night is coming again, that the prophecy of the prince who was promised is the prophecy of the next Azor Ahai, that she has been given the task of finding that person and ensuring they are ready for what is coming. Her entire theology is built on the conviction that the long night was not a one-time catastrophe, but the first instance of a recurring event, and that the pattern demands a recurring hero. Whether she is right about the specific mechanics of the prophecy, whether she has identified the right person, whether her theology perfectly maps onto what is actually happening, is a question the story does not resolve cleanly. But whether she is right about the pattern? The long night suggests she might be. Jon Snow is the figure who carries the most weight of the Azor Ahai parallel in the show. He has already died and been resurrected, a detail that the Lord of Light religion treats as confirmation of divine purpose. He has already led the dead back from beyond the wall and shown the living what they are actually fighting. His relationships with Ygritte, with Daenerys, carry the specific gravity of the Azor Ahai narrative in ways that feel deliberate rather than coincidental. Whether Jon will have to make the same choice Azor Ahai made, whether the parallel will resolve in the same way or find a different answer, is one of the deepest questions that George R.R. Martin has planted in the roots of his story, 12,000 years below the surface of the narrative. Daenerys is fire made manifest, in a way that has no real equivalent anywhere else in the story. She hatched dragons from eggs that had been stone for a century and a half. She walked into fire and was not consumed. She commands creatures whose breath burns at temperatures that conventional fire cannot reach. She is, in the symbolic logic of the world, exactly the kind of ally that someone facing the long night again would want. And also, perhaps exactly, the kind of weapon that someone would have to find a way to both wield and contain, given that fire without direction is simply destruction. The story makes this ambivalence about Daenerys central to everything. She is the solution and also, if handled incorrectly, an additional catastrophe. Let the long night recede now. Let the darkness it brought, the cold it carried, the terrible specific grief of the myth of Nissa, all of it move gently backward into the deep past where it belongs. You are warm. The light has returned. The fire that Azor Ahai lit 12,000 years ago has never really gone out. It has just changed its form, moved through different vessels, expressed itself in different metaphors, but the warmth has persisted. The warmth you feel right now, in your body, in this room, in this ordinary night that is not a long night. That warmth is the distant echo of a fire that someone built at enormous cost and kept burning and passed forward through 12,000 years of winters. Sleep is moving closer now. The way sleep always does when the body has been permitted to be still long enough. Let it come. There is nothing pressing at the edges of this moment. The long night ended. The darkness lifted. The morning came, slowly, painfully, over many months of returning light. But it came. It always comes. That is what the Age of Heroes discovered, at the highest possible price, and the discovery is still true tonight. From the wreckage of the long night, from the ash and grief of a generation spent in darkness, there rose the man whose name would outlast every throne that was ever built or broken in Westeros. The first of the great builders, the first of the Starks, the man who looked at the end of the world and decided, quietly and deliberately to build something that might keep it from happening again. Now we come to the name that everything tonight has been quietly moving toward. Bran. Just Bran. The one who built. The name is so simple and so old that it carries the particular weight of words that have been worn smooth by 12,000 years of use, like a river stone that has lost its rough edges, not from violence, but from the patient accumulation of water moving across it for an inconceivable stretch of time. The name Bran the Builder stands at the origin point of so much of Westeros's subsequent history that approaching him directly, honestly, with the intellectual care he deserves, requires us first to acknowledge something that is uncomfortable. We do not know with certainty that he existed. Let that settle for a moment, not because it diminishes the importance of what he represents, but because the uncertainty itself is one of the most interesting things about him. The wall exists. It is 700 feet of ancient ice, stretching 300 miles from the gorge in the west to the shivering sea in the east. And it is unquestionably real, unquestionably ancient, and unquestionably not a natural formation. Winterfell exists, has existed for 8,000 years at minimum, is built on hot springs that suggest a level of engineering intelligence far beyond what one would expect from a builder, working in the chaotic aftermath of the long night. The castle that houses the Night's Watch at the Shadow Tower exists. These buildings are real. The builder, on the other hand, is a figure the maesters of the Citadel have argued about for centuries, and their argument has never been fully resolved. What we know about Bran the Builder comes almost entirely from the traditions of House Stark and from the legends that House Stark's 8,000-year presence in the north has generated. He is credited with founding House Stark itself, with being the first of the Starks, the original one, from whose blood all subsequent Starks descend. He is credited with building Winterfell, that ancient fortress over the hot springs of the north. He is credited with building the wall, working with giants whose strength could lift stones and ice blocks no ordinary human crew could manage. He is sometimes credited with helping to build Storm's End for Durran Godsgrief in the far south, though the geography of that claim, requiring the same builder to have worked simultaneously or near simultaneously on both the northernmost and southernmost major construction projects in Westeros, has given scholars pause for a very long time. The maesters who have studied the question most carefully tend toward a theory that is unsatisfying to heroic tradition, but perhaps more historically honest. That Bran the Builder is a composite legend. That the name Bran, which is a common name in Stark family history, appearing again and again across the generations, was attached to the great constructions of an entire era. That the deeds of multiple people across multiple generations were eventually collapsed into a single narrative featuring a single impossibly capable figure. This happens in every culture's heroic tradition. It is how the human mind processes the achievements of a civilization. It needs a face and a name to attach to them, because the face and the name are what memory can hold, even when the reality was more diffuse and collaborative and complicated than any single life could contain. This theory, if it is correct, does not diminish Bran the Builder. It changes what he is. He becomes not one man who built the impossible, but the name Westeros gave to its own collective capability. The name that was placed over the achievement the way a frame is placed over a painting, not to claim credit for the painting, but to give it a location in memory, a way of being referred to and transmitted. The wall was built by many people, over many years, with many kinds of help. The name Bran the Builder is the way those thousands of individual contributions were compressed into something that 12,000 years of descendants could carry in their minds without losing the essential fact that someone built it, that the building was intentional and extraordinary, and that it deserves to be remembered. It is worth pausing here and sitting with what that means, because it is actually a profound idea about the nature of historical memory. We live in an age that tends to attribute great achievements to great individuals, the inventor, the general, the founder, the visionary, partly because of how our culture processes achievement, and partly because narrative requires a protagonist. But most of the greatest achievements in human history were collective endeavors. The accumulated work of communities and generations and countless unnamed individuals whose specific contributions are irretrievable. What we have instead of their actual names is the name of the person who happened to stand at the front, or the name that the story needed, or the name that simply survived when all the others were lost. Bran the Builder may be one of the world's oldest and largest examples of this compression. The wall is more real than the man who supposedly built it. And perhaps the wall, in some sense, is the more important thing to remember anyway. But there are details in the Bran the Builder legends that resist the simple composite explanation. Details that suggest, if not a single historical individual, at least a specific and unusual kind of person who was genuinely responsible for something genuinely unprecedented. The legends consistently describe Bran the Builder as having worked with the children of the forest, not just with human labourers and giants. They describe him as having woven magic into the wall, not simply constructed it from natural materials, but woven something older and deeper into its foundations, something that the children understood and he understood alongside them. This implies that whoever the historical Bran was, they possessed a kind of knowledge and a kind of relationship with the ancient world that was not ordinary even by the standards of the Age of Heroes. The green sight runs in Stark blood. It always has. The specific magical sensitivity that allows a Stark to be a skin changer, a warg, someone who sends their consciousness into another creature's body. This runs through the family in an unbroken line from the distant past to Bran Stark and his siblings. If the original Bran the Builder possessed this sensitivity in a particularly strong form, then his collaboration with the children of the forest becomes easier to understand. He was not simply a builder who hired the children as magical consultants. He may have been someone who could speak to them, commune with them, understand what they understood about the deep structure of the world and what it would take to bind the magic into something as large and as permanent as the wall required. The name Brandon, in the language of the first men, meant something close to prince or raven or firebrand, depending on which linguistic scholar you ask. It is not a humble name. It is not the name of an ordinary craftsman or a practical engineer. It is the name of someone who saw themselves or was seen by their community as something elevated, a figure of significance in a time already full of significant figures. That the name keeps appearing in Stark family history. Brandon the Builder, Brandon the Breaker, Brandon Ice Eyes, Brandon Stark, who was Ned's brother, Bran Stark, the youngest surviving son, suggests a family tradition of deliberately recycling names whose weight they felt honoured to carry, whose legacy they wanted to claim continuity with. Every Bran in Stark history is, in some sense, a renewed declaration of inheritance. Winterfell itself bears witness to its builder's intelligence in ways that are easy to overlook until you think about them carefully. The castle is heated by a network of hot springs that run beneath it, natural geothermal energy captured and channeled through walls and floors to keep the stone warm even in the depths of a northern winter. Was this Bran the Builder's design? Or was it an accident of geology that he was simply clever enough to build around? Either answer is impressive. If he designed the hot spring system deliberately, then he was an engineer of the first order, someone who understood fluid dynamics and thermal circulation well enough to build a self-heating castle. If he simply chose to build on that particular spot because the ground was warm, then he was an observer of extraordinary sensitivity, someone who noticed what the land offered and built in conversation with it, rather than in opposition to it. The Godswood of Winterfell contains a weirwood tree, whose trunk is as wide as a man is tall, whose roots have spread through the foundations of the castle over 8,000 years of growth. The face carved into that tree, the wide staring eyes, the open screaming mouth, the red sap running like tears, is the oldest resident of Winterfell, older even than the castle walls, watching everything that has happened in that place for the entire span of Stark history. Ned Stark prays before this face. He sharpens his sword before it. He holds his children before it. He makes his most serious and most private decisions in its presence. It is the oldest relationship in the story, the relationship between the Starks and this one particular watching face. And Bran the Builder, whoever he was, is the one who placed the castle around it. In the show, the final scene of Bran Stark shows him being wheeled away from a small council chamber where his advisors are arguing about the mundane business of governance. He glides out from under their debates into the open air, his eyes distant, his attention somewhere else entirely. This is not a triumphant conclusion in the conventional sense. It is something quieter and stranger. The image of a boy who fell from a window and lost the use of his legs but gained the use of 12,000 years of human memory, who holds more of the world's past in his consciousness than any other living being, who may be slowly becoming something more like a weirwood tree than a king. He carries the name of his ancestor, the Builder. He carries what the Builder built, in the sense that everything Westeros is flows through the world that the Wall made possible. The name has come full circle. It has not lost any of its weight. Whatever Bran the Builder actually was, one man, several men, a composite legend, a green seer of extraordinary power, working at the junction of the human world and the ancient one. The thing he made, or the thing made in his name, stands as proof of something. It stands as proof that even in the immediate, desperate aftermath of the worst catastrophe in Westerosi history, someone or some people had the vision and the will to look at the end of the world and decide to build something in its place, not simply to survive, not simply to endure, but to build, to raise something permanent and deliberate, and meant to outlast not just one generation, but all of them, something that would be here when the original builders were long forgotten, and everything they personally knew and loved was gone. That is not ordinary ambition. That is something closer to an act of faith. Let the image of the Builder settle now. Not a single man with a hammer and a blueprint, but the accumulated intention of everyone who looked at the need for the Wall and decided to be part of answering it. The great things in this world are rarely made by one person. They are made by the alignment of many people behind a single idea that is larger than any of them individually. Bran the Builder is the name for that alignment, the name for that idea, the name for the decision that the world was worth protecting. Sleep gently with that tonight. If the history we have explored together tonight has helped quiet your mind, we would be grateful if you subscribed. New stories are always waiting, as old as these ones, and as far from the ordinary world as the Wall is from the warmth you feel right now. Subscribe, and we will be here when you return. The wall was only the beginning of what Bran the Builder left behind. 700 feet of ice and ancient magic were raising their shadow over Westeros, keeping the darkest things in the world contained. But keeping a wall is not the same as understanding why it was built. And over the following 12,000 years, that forgetting would cost everything. Segment 5. The wall, ice older than memory. 700 feet, 300 miles. Let those numbers simply exist for a moment before we try to place them in any context, because context sometimes makes things smaller rather than larger, and the wall deserves to be enormous before it becomes comprehensible. 700 feet is roughly twice the height of the tallest medieval cathedral ever built. 300 miles is the length of a coastline. It is the distance you would walk at a steady pace for 10 hours a day over an entire month. Now imagine that distance as a single continuous structure of ice, rising 700 feet above the ground at every point along its length. And you are beginning to approach what it means to stand at the base of the wall and tilt your head back. Let your body be heavy. Let your mind be quiet. We are inside one of the strangest architectural achievements in the history of any fictional world, and the way to truly apprehend it is not through the intellect but through the senses, through the cold that emanates from it even on a summer day, through the way it catches the light at certain hours and glows from within with a blue that has no equivalent anywhere in ordinary nature, through the sound the wind makes when it finds the gaps and angles of 700 feet of ancient ice and turns itself into something between a moan and a note of music. The wall is not a dead thing. It breathes in its way. It shifts. It makes sounds in the night that the men of the Night's Watch have been cataloguing and failing to fully explain for thousands of years. The ice from which the wall is made is not ordinary ice. This is one of the few points on which the legends, the Night's Watch traditions, the Maester's scholarship, and the direct sensory experience of characters who touch the wall all agree. Something about the ice is different. It is harder than ice formed by the natural freezing of water, harder, denser, less likely to melt at temperatures that should reduce it, as though the centuries of cold compacted into it have changed its molecular nature into something that is no longer quite the same substance it started as. Some scholars have suggested that the ice at the wall's core dates to the long night itself, that the original construction used ice formed during the absolute zero of that terrible winter. Ice that carries the cold of that era, preserved in its crystal structure, like an insect preserved in amber. Whether that is literally true or not, the wall does contain something beyond ordinary ice. The magic in its foundations is not speculation. It is demonstrated by the fact that the whites and the animated dead raised by the others cannot pass through the structures at the base of the wall without specific permissions being granted. The Night's Watch maintains elaborate rituals at the gates, the Black Gate at the Night Fort, the underground passage that requires the speaking of oaths. And these rituals are not simply traditional formalities. They are functional. They are the operating interface for something woven into the construction itself, something placed there by whoever built the wall and maintained there by the faith and commitment of whoever served it afterward. The wall works because people believe in the wall and act accordingly. When that belief falters, when the serving becomes hollow ritual rather than genuine commitment, the wall grows weaker in ways that are difficult to measure but real. 19 castles were originally built along the wall's southern face, spaced roughly equidistant along its 300-mile length, each one designed to house a garrison of several hundred brothers of the Night's Watch. In the time of the main story, only 3 of those castles are still manned. The other 16 stand empty, their gates sealed, their towers housing nothing but wind and birds, and the accumulating evidence of a watch that has been in slow decline for centuries. Castle Black is the watch's headquarters, and has perhaps 1,000 brothers at full strength, though the numbers fluctuate. The Shadow Tower at the western end is held by a small garrison. Eastwatch by the sea guards the eastern shore, and the 16 empty castles stand along the wall's length, like abandoned milestones marking the distance between what the watch was supposed to be and what it has become. This decline matters enormously. The wall was not designed to function with minimal manning. It was designed to be fully garrisoned along its entire length, with brothers patrolling between the castles and maintaining the constant vigilance that the ancient builders understood the barrier required. The gradual reduction of the watch to a skeleton crew is not simply an institutional failure. It is, in the terms of how the wall's magic appears to work, a spiritual failure. The faith component is real. The wall is not a machine that operates regardless of whether anyone tends it. It is something closer to a relationship between the living and the dead, between the committed and the threat they have committed to contain. When the men of the watch stop truly believing in what they are doing, the wall stops truly believing in itself. And then Viserion's blue fire reaches its ancient ice, and Eastwatch falls, and what 12,000 years of faith maintained is gone in an hour. The horn said to be capable of destroying the wall, the Horn of Winter, Joramun's horn, was supposedly used once by the king beyond the wall named Joramun to wake giants from the earth. The legends say that if it is blown again, it will bring the wall down entirely. In the show, this becomes a dragon. But the underlying logic is the same. The wall's destruction requires a force whose power exists on the same mythological level as the force that created it. You cannot bring down the wall with an ordinary battering ram or an ordinary army. You need something that speaks the same ancient language that the wall was built in, something that operates in the register of magic, of the deep structural forces that the children of the forest and whoever built with them understood and could work with. The wall was not built in the register of ordinary construction. It cannot be destroyed in that register either. The Night's Watch was founded specifically to man the wall, not simultaneously with its construction, but shortly after, once it became clear that a permanent barrier required permanent defenders. The founders of the Watch understood something that subsequent generations would gradually forget: that the wall alone was not enough. A wall without watchers is just a very large rock. The agreement, never formally written anywhere that survives but present in every tradition associated with the Night's Watch, was that men would give their lives to the wall in a specific and complete sense. They would give up their names, their family connections, their inheritances, their prior identities. They would take the black and take the oath. They would be the Watch. The complete surrender of personal identity to institutional purpose was the Watch's founding logic, and it was also its fatal flaw. Because an institution that demands the complete erasure of individual identity eventually finds it has attracted mainly men with reasons to want to be erased. The Oath of the Night's Watch is one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in the main series, if you hear it as it was intended, not as a military formality, but as a genuine existential commitment to an idea. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. These are not small claims. These are the claims of someone who has accepted the full weight of what the wall represents, who understands that the darkness is real, that the cold is real, that the sleepers who need waking are real, and that someone has to stand between the world and those things without any expectation of personal reward or recognition. The oath is magnificent because it is honest. It asks for everything, and it offers nothing in return except the meaning that comes from having everything asked of you. Jon Snow takes this oath at the wall, in the great darkness beneath an ancient tree, in the company of men he has known for only months, but will serve alongside for the rest of his life. At this moment in the story, Jon does not fully understand what he is committing to. None of the young men taking their vows that night do. They have heard the stories, but the stories are old, and the stories are half-believed, and the wall itself, while impressive, seems at that moment like a structure built against something that no longer really exists. The Watch feels like an institution going through the motions of a purpose it has outlived. But the thing the oath was written to address has not gone anywhere. It has just been waiting, patiently. The way the cold waits, not with urgency, not with impatience, but with the absolute certainty that time will eventually give it what it wants. What the wall represents at its deepest level is an acknowledgement, not a solution. A wall is not a solution. It is a containment strategy, a way of buying time. The wall is Westeros's formal acknowledgement that the world contains forces it cannot defeat, only hold at bay. It is the monument to the moment when the survivors of the Long Night looked at what had almost destroyed them and said, "We cannot destroy this in return. We can only build something big enough to keep it separated from us and hope that the separation holds." That is not a triumphant posture. It is an honest one. The wall is 12,000 years of honesty about the limits of human power, expressed in 700 feet of ancient ice, and the magic of a people who understood those limits better than anyone. Samwell Tarly discovers, in his reading at the Citadel, a passage that confirms something that had long been implied. That the Watch's vows, and specifically the Black Gate at the Night Fort through which Sam and Gilly escape, are not simply traditional formalities. The gate opens only to those who speak the vow. The wall's magic is keyed to the Watch's commitment. Sam holding a baby in a blizzard, speaking the old words alone to a door that looks like a face, and having the door open for him. This is one of the quietest and most important moments in the story. It confirms that the ancient machinery is still functional, that the connection between human faith and magical infrastructure that the builders built into the wall 12,000 years ago is still operative. The wall still works. The Watch has simply forgotten how. In the show's 7th season, the wall at Eastwatch is destroyed by Viserion, the dragon killed beyond the wall and resurrected by the Night King, whose blue fire burns through the ancient ice as though the centuries of cold and magic and faith accumulated in it were simply not there. And in one sense, they were not. The magic had been failing for a long time before Viserion's fire reached it. The Watch had been hollowing out for centuries. The faith had been replaced by tradition, the tradition by rote, the rote by something that barely registered as even going through the motions. By the time the dragon's fire arrived, the wall had been spiritually empty for a generation. The ice fell because what it required to stand, the genuine, sustained, believing commitment of the people serving it, had been withdrawn so slowly and so completely that no one had noticed it happening until it was too late. Let the wall rise in your mind now, pale and enormous against a grey sky, the cold coming off it in waves you can feel even at a distance, the blue glow at certain angles that has no explanation in ordinary physics. 700 feet, 300 miles. Built at the end of the world by someone who understood that the world needed protecting and decided to do something about it. The wall is still there, even in the story where it has been destroyed. It is there in the memory of everyone who served it, and everyone who crossed it, and everyone who looked up at it, and felt that particular combination of awe and smallness that only very large and very old things can produce. The ice is gone. The memory holds. Your body is warm. The cold that the wall was built to keep at bay is very far away from where you're resting tonight. Let that warmth be felt, the specific personal warmth of your own body, in this specific room, on this specific night. The wall was built so that someone, 12,000 years later, could rest in this warmth without knowing why the warmth had been preserved. That is one of the greatest gifts any builder ever gave. Safety so complete that the people inside it forget there was ever a threat. Bran the Builder raised his wall and raised his castle, and raised the great family whose name would carry his legacy forward for 12,000 years. But the Age of Heroes was not made of one man alone. Across the length and breadth of Westeros, other impossible figures were doing things that no single human life should have been able to accomplish, and their shadows stretch just as long into the present as his does. Bran the Builder did not work alone. The Age of Heroes was crowded with impossible people, figures whose ambitions and deeds ran so far beyond the ordinary scale of human achievement that the later ages could only accommodate them by placing them in the category of legend. This is worth understanding clearly. In calling them legends, we are not dismissing them. We are describing the process by which human history manages the people who do things large enough to be permanently disorienting. When a deed is too large for the time that produced it, the time responds by mythologizing the deed and the person behind it, by lifting them out of ordinary narrative and placing them in a different register, one where gods and impossible events and superhuman capabilities are the accepted backdrop. The Age of Heroes produced so many of these people that it eventually named itself after them. Let your breathing continue its slow, easy rhythm. We are moving through a gallery tonight, not a formal gallery with labelled exhibits, but something more like a night walk through the oldest and most overgrown garden in the world, where the statues have been standing so long that moss has softened their features, and the inscriptions at their bases have mostly worn away, and you must read them partly from what remains and partly from the stories that have accumulated around each figure like leaves around a stone. Each figure in this garden paid a price for what they became. That is the detail the legends consistently preserve, even when everything else has been embellished or distorted. The cost. Every hero of the Age of Heroes gave something up that could not be recovered. Durran Godsgrief is one of the great romantic figures in Westerosi legend, and his story is also, if you look at it without the romantic overlay, one of the most quietly devastating ones. He was a mortal man who fell in love with Elenay, the daughter of the god of the sea and the goddess of the wind, two ancient divine forces whose children were not meant for human love. Elenay chose Durran anyway, surrendered her immortality by accepting his love and became mortal herself, and in doing so, triggered the fury of the gods she had left behind. Her parents destroyed every castle Durran built to house their love. 6 times Durran built, and 6 times the storms came off the sea. and the wind came off the hills, and the construction was torn down to its foundations. The sixth castle fell the same way the first 5 had fallen, completely without mercy, as though the sea and the wind were operating not out of malice, but simply out of the indifferent application of natural law, which is in some ways more terrible than malice. Malice can be negotiated with, appealed to, reasoned with. Natural law simply is. And yet Durran built again. The 7th castle, the one that became Storm's End, the great drum of stone that has stood at the end of the Stormlands ever since. Survived? How it survived is the detail the legend is most invested in, and the detail the legend is least clear about. The structure of the walls, the absence of windows facing the most dangerous directions, the thickness of the stone, these may be sufficient explanation. Or the legends may be right that Bran the Builder, who was a very old man by this time, came south to help design the foundations that the gods could not tear down. What strikes me about Durran's story, and what I want you to hold with you for a moment before we continue, is not the heroism of building 6 times after 6 destructions. That is certainly striking. It is the specific nature of what he built toward. Not a fortress against human enemies, not a symbol of political power, but a home. He was building a home for a woman who had given up her immortality to be with him. The gods kept tearing it down because that love was not supposed to exist. And he kept building because he had decided, with the absolute clarity of a person who has found the thing they will not yield on, that the love was worth the cost of the building. Storm's End is the monument to that decision. Every gale that has battered its walls since is the sea and wind still trying to unmake what Durran made. They have not yet succeeded. The Grey King of the Iron Islands is a figure of a completely different kind, oceanic in scale and temperament, a king of the sea rather than the land, and one of the most genuinely alien figures in the Age of Heroes mythology. He is said to have ruled for 1,000 years, which is not a number meant to be taken literally, but is meant to communicate a duration so great that it exceeds anything the ordinary human vocabulary for kingship can encompass. He is said to have fought and killed Naga, the greatest sea dragon the world had ever known, and to have made Naga's bones into the roof beams of his mead hall, and Naga's teeth into the outer walls. His throne was made from Naga's jawbone. He cooked his food in the fires of Naga's still-burning belly, which the legend says never quite went out. He is also said to have taken a mermaid for his queen, which tells us something important about the Iron Islands' ancient self-image. The Grey King did not love human things. He loved the sea, the deepest, strangest, most dangerous parts of the sea, the parts where the light does not penetrate, and the creatures are old enough to have names in languages that predate human speech. To take a mermaid as your queen is to claim sovereignty not just over the surface of the sea but over what lies beneath it, the world that no land creature can truly reach. The Ironborn culture of the present day, their pride, their sense of themselves as a people apart, their conviction that what is paid for in iron and blood is more honestly owned than what is merely inherited, all of this flows from the Grey King's legend. He set the template for what an Ironborn is supposed to value. Simeon Stareyes offers a different kind of story, more purely martial than Durran's, more purely human than the Grey King's, but strange in its own specific way. Simeon was a knight before there were knights, a warrior of the Age of Heroes whose skills with a sword were so extraordinary that the legends placed him in the same conversation as figures from much later chivalric tradition. He was blinded in battle, and here is where the story takes its strange turn. He replaced his eyes with sapphires. 2 blue gems, fitted into the empty sockets, and the legends say that after this he could see better than before, that the sapphires gave him a different kind of sight, the kind that looks through things rather than simply at them. Whether this is metaphor or magic or simple narrative embellishment is impossible to say. But the image is striking and has never quite left the culture that produced it. A man who lost his sight and replaced it with something that saw more than eyes can see. What all these figures share: Durran defying the gods with his seventh castle, the Grey King swallowing the sea's greatest predator and making it his home, Simeon replacing human sight with something beyond human sight, is a fundamental refusal to accept the limits placed on them. This is the defining characteristic of the Age of Heroes, the quality that distinguishes its figures from the figures of later ages. They looked at the thing that was supposed to defeat them, and they decided not to be defeated by it. This sounds simple stated directly, but the specific forms it took were never simple. The cost was always proportional to the refusal. Durran's refusal cost him 6 castles, and presumably everything that was inside them. The Grey King's refusal to accept the sea's dominance over him cost him his human relationships, his connection to the land, whatever ordinary life a man of his era might have had. Simeon paid with his eyes. The Age of Heroes was not an age of men and women who avoided cost. It was an age of men and women who accepted cost so completely that the legends built around them are fundamentally stories about the relationship between what you want and what you are willing to give up for it. This is different from the heroic tradition of many other cultures, where the hero tends to win without losing, where the price is paid by the villain rather than the hero, where the happy ending is genuinely happy. In Westeros, the happy endings of the Age of Heroes all have grief built into their foundations. Storm's End stands, but Elenay died mortal. The Grey King ruled for 1,000 years, but his sons were lesser men than he was, and the mead hall of Naga's bones eventually fell. Simeon could see with his sapphire eyes, but sapphires are cold and they do not cry. In the present-day story, the great houses of Westeros carry these ancient stories in the way that old wounds are carried, as part of the body now, integrated into the structure, shaping how the body moves even when the original injury is long past. The Baratheons of Storm's End have never quite shaken the specific quality of stubbornness and defiance that characterizes Durran Godsgrief, the absolute refusal to yield, which is a magnificent virtue until it becomes an inflexible flaw, which in Stannis Baratheon it does with a clarity that his ancestor would recognize even if he would not understand it. The Ironborn carry the Grey King's contempt for what grows on land, his conviction that the sea is the only honest master, his belief that anything not paid for in blood is not truly owned, and this conviction, magnificent in the age that produced it, becomes in the present day a cultural disposition toward raiding that has made the Iron Islands a political liability for 1,000 years. Theon Greyjoy is the most interesting contemporary descendant of the Grey King's tradition, not because he embodies it most completely, but because he is the member of the Greyjoy family most visibly caught between its pull and the world he actually inhabits. He was raised in Winterfell, among the Starks, with their different set of values, their loyalty, their directness, their specific relationship to the cold and to the land. He was raised within 100 yards of the weirwood that the Starks have been praying before for 8,000 years. And then he was sent home to his father and told to be Iron Islands again. The tragedy of Theon is the tragedy of the Grey King's legacy, meeting a world where the Grey King's world no longer exists. The 1,000-year reign is over. The sea dragon's bones have rotted. But the culture that legend built around those bones still demands that its sons be the Grey King reborn, and the demand is impossible to satisfy. Balon Greyjoy, declaring himself King of the Iron Islands with an absolute conviction that seems unshaken by the overwhelming evidence that the political reality of Westeros has moved on from the era in which that claim would have been respected, is in this light not simply a prideful fool, but a man performing faithfully the character that the Grey King's legend requires of him, performing it in a world that has run out of room for that performance, but has not yet worked out how to tell the Ironborn this. Yara Greyjoy, by contrast, understands that survival in the present age requires some adjustment of the old template, not the abandonment of the Ironborn identity, but its evolution, its adaptation to a world that has changed around it. Whether she succeeds or fails, she is trying to do something the Grey King never needed to do, to be the legend and also be practical. The Age of Heroes produced figures who set templates that their descendants have been trying to live up to, or live inside, or live down, ever since. The templates were enormous, built for an enormous age, an age of dragons and sea dragons and weirwood magic, and the active and perceivable presence of gods in the world. The world has gotten quieter since then. The gods have receded, or gone silent, or perhaps simply become more subtle. The sea dragons are gone. The giants are almost gone. The magic is thinner, and the people who carry these ancient templates in their blood and their culture are left trying to perform gestures of mythological scale in a world that has become, in comparison to what it was, quite small. Rest now in the gallery of impossible people. The moss is soft on their stone feet. The inscriptions are worn but legible if you trace the letters with your fingers. They are not gone. They are preserved in the families that carry their names, in the castles that bear their marks, in the cultural reflexes that persist long after their original reasons have been forgotten. The Age of Heroes was not a time of pure glory. It was a time of enormous cost, paid by enormous people, for the world that came after them. You are resting in that world tonight. You are the beneficiary of every price that was paid. Every great institution carries within it the seed of its own corruption, and the Night's Watch, built to stand eternal guard in the place that Bran the Builder raised, would one day be led by a man who looked into the very darkness the wall was built to exclude and chose, irrevocably and terribly, to let it in. There is a shadow that falls across Bran the Builder's legacy, and it comes not from outside but from within, from the very institution that the wall was built to need, from the lineage that Bran the Builder himself established, from a man who stood where Jon Snow would later stand, and faced a choice that Jon Snow would also face, and arrived at a different answer. His name is not spoken in the story. It was struck from every record, every monument, every oral tradition that the Starks and their allies could reach. What remains is a title, not a name, the Night's King. And the title tells you everything you need to know about what he chose. Let your breath slow further. What we are entering now is the most unsettling chapter in the history of the Night's Watch. The story of what happens when the people who are supposed to guard something become the thing they are guarding against. This is not a comfortable story, and I do not want to rush through it or soften its edges too aggressively, because discomfort sometimes has things to teach us, that comfort cannot. But we will move through it slowly, in the way that difficult things can be approached when the body is at rest and the mind is not defending itself. And on the other side of it, there is something important to understand about the nature of Bran the Builder's true legacy, which is not simply a wall, but a question: who guards the Guardians? The Night's King was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. The 13th. There is something almost biblical about that number in the context of the story. 13, the number after the last one people normally count to. The number that suggests an excess, a going one too far. Old Nan tells Bran Stark this story with the particular relish she reserves for the tales that she knows are true, in the way that the most frightening things are true. Not necessarily in every specific detail, but in their essential nature, in what they reveal about how the world actually works underneath the reassuring surface of how we prefer it to work. She says the Night's King was a Stark. She says he was a great warrior. She says he was everything the Watch needed in a Lord Commander. Brave, skilled, experienced, committed. And then something happened that the official histories refuse to describe clearly, because what happened next is the kind of thing that official histories always refuse to describe clearly. He found a woman on the top of the wall. The legends describe her with a specificity that is arresting even after 12,000 years of retelling. Blue eyes like stars, skin cold and pale as the wall itself. A beauty that was not quite human, in a way that was difficult to name precisely, but impossible to miss. She was, in all likelihood, one of the others, or someone touched by the others in a way that had changed her into something that occupied the boundary between the living and whatever it is the others represent. She was the thing the wall had been built to keep out, and the Night's King, standing on top of the wall that his ancestor had raised as the great barrier between the world of the living and the world of cold and death, looked at this woman and chose her. He brought her to the Night Fort, the greatest and most ancient of the castles on the wall, a sprawling fortress whose original dimensions exceeded those of most southern castles, whose history by that point already included things that the brothers who served there had learned to avoid discussing in detail. He declared her his queen. He ruled with her for 13 years. What happened during those 13 years, in the specific and practical sense, the legends describe in terms that are consistently vague, but consistently terrible. He gave the bodies of his sworn brothers to the others. Whether this means he killed them and delivered the bodies, or whether the bodies were used in the rituals by which the others create their dead soldiers, or whether something else entirely was happening, the legends are not precise. They are precise about the duration, 13 years, and they are precise about the outcome, which was that the Night's Watch had been turned into the instrument of the thing it was created to oppose. It is worth pausing here, because this is the exact center of the shadow that falls across the Age of Heroes, the dark implication that lives at the heart of every great institution built in that era. Bran the Builder raised the wall to separate the world of the living from the others and the cold and the dead. He founded the Night's Watch to defend that wall. He presumably did both of these things with the full understanding of what he was building against and why. And yet within the span of 13 Lord Commanders, not 13 centuries, not 13,000 years, but 13 individual men, the span of a single human lifetime at most, the institution had produced someone who dismantled the entire purpose of the institution and offered it to the enemy. The betrayal was not external. It grew from inside the thing itself. What does it say about the nature of any institution built to stand forever, that the first catastrophic failure came from within? The answer the Night's King's story offers is uncomfortable but honest. The institution failed because it demanded too much of human nature. The oath of the Night's Watch asks men to surrender their names, their families, their inheritances, their personal desires, their entire prior identity, in exchange for a life of cold service on the edge of the known world. This is a profound and in some ways beautiful demand. It is also a demand that human nature, in its deepest and most irresistible aspects, tends eventually to find ways around. The Night's King was not a weak man. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of man the Watch wanted. Strong, capable, long experienced. He was the man who had given everything the Watch asked for. And perhaps it was precisely because he had given everything the Watch asked for that when something offered him what the Watch had taken away, the warmth of a specific, personal, private love, he could not refuse it. The name of the Night's King was erased from all records. The Starks, who were by this point the kings ruling to the south of the Wall, in Winterfell, worked with the king beyond the Wall of that era to defeat him. His 13-year reign was ended. He and his queen were killed or removed or driven from the Night Fort. The legends are not specific about how the ending happened, which is itself characteristic of how the story manages events it finds most difficult to process. What is specific is the aftermath, the deliberate systematic erasure of his name. Every stone where his name was carved was recut. Every record where it appeared was altered or destroyed. His reign was acknowledged. The numbering continued from 13, so the subsequent Lord Commanders were all aware that someone had occupied the position before them, but the name was removed. He became the Night's King, a title, a warning, a cautionary role without a specific human being attached to it. The erasure of a name from history is one of the most extreme acts available to any culture that takes naming seriously. In the world of Westeros, where the weirwood trees remember everything, and the maesters archive everything, and the singers preserve everything in song, to successfully remove a name is genuinely unusual and genuinely difficult. The Starks managed it because they had the motivation. A Stark of Winterfell who had become the most extreme possible traitor to everything the Stark name was supposed to represent. And because they had the power, as kings of the North, to mandate the removal, they chose, as a family, that the shame of the Night's King would not be carried in their official history. What they could not erase was the story itself. Old Nan still tells it. The people of the North still know the basic shape of it. The shame is remembered even when the name is not. That distinction is the thing the Starks could not quite manage. Jon Snow, 200 years before the events of the main story, would be described as the greatest Lord Commander the Night's Watch had produced since the Night's King himself, though whoever said it presumably meant it as a compliment about military skill, rather than a prophecy about what might follow. Jon does not become the Night's King, but he walks very close to the same edge. He loves something he is not supposed to love. First Ygritte, who is a wildling, and therefore technically his enemy. Then Daenerys, who is his queen and his aunt, and the focus of a political loyalty that conflicts with his personal one. He makes decisions as Lord Commander that the Watch's traditionalists believe violate the spirit of the oath, letting wildlings through the wall, collaborating with the enemy. He is murdered for it by his own men in the courtyard of Castle Black. The parallel between Jon and the Night's King is one of Martin's most carefully maintained structural miracles in the story. They occupy the same position. They both love across a forbidden boundary. They are both accused by their brothers of having betrayed the Watch in favor of a personal attachment. The Night's King betrayed the Watch completely, gave it over to the darkness, offered his sworn brothers to the enemy, turned the institution inside out. Jon does not. Jon is murdered before he can, or before anyone can find out if he would, or before the question can be resolved clearly enough for either his defenders or his accusers to claim final vindication. The ambiguity is the point. The story puts Jon in the Night's King's position to ask, what is the difference between a man who falls and a man who holds? And the answer the story gives is, sometimes we cannot know until it is too late, and sometimes we cannot even know then. There is a cruelty in erasing a name while remembering the deed. And that cruelty is the cruelty the Night's King's story asks us to sit with for a long moment before we move on. By striking his name from history, the Starks ensured that the specific, individual, human story of why he fell, what led to that moment on the wall, what the woman with the star-blue eyes represented, to a man who had given his personal life entirely to an institution, what it felt like to look at something forbidden and choose it anyway, was replaced with a warning label. The Night's King, the category, the example, the three-word lesson about what Lord Commanders must not do. He became less than a person, and more than a person simultaneously, reduced to a role while expanded into a myth. Whether that is justice, or simply the way power manages its failures, the Night's King's story leaves that question open and unresolved, the way the truest questions tend to. The Night Fort, where he ruled for those 13 years, still stands. It is the largest and oldest castle on the wall. Its towers fallen now, its halls open to the wind, its courtyards collecting snow and silence. Sam and Gilly pass through it in the story, a terrifying night passage through the oldest and most haunted structure on the wall, through the black gate in its well that opens only to those who speak the oath. The Night Fort remembers. Its stones hold something of what happened there, the way old stones hold temperature, slowly releasing what they have absorbed long after the source is gone. There is a particular quality of silence in the deepest rooms of the Night Fort, Sam notices, that is different from the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of things that are still present, but no longer quite alive. Whether that is Sam's imagination or something older than his fear, the story leaves, as it so often leaves such things, open. Let the Night's King recede now into the specific darkness he belongs to, the darkness of history's worst decisions, made by people who were capable of better and chose otherwise. His story is a warning, but it is also, if you look at it with enough patience and without too much judgment, a tragedy in the oldest sense. A great person who fell from a great height because of a great flaw, and the fall was complete, and the consequences were real, and the name was taken away, but the lesson remained. That is what tragedy does. It takes the name away and leaves the lesson. It is the cruelest and most useful kind of story. If the history we have explored together tonight has helped quiet your mind, we would be grateful if you subscribed. New stories are always waiting, as old as these ones and as far from the ordinary world as the wall is from the warmth you feel right now. Subscribe, and we will be here when you return. The Night's King was erased. His name was struck from every stone, but you cannot erase what a man represents, only what he was called. And what he represented would wait, patient as winter, for the next man who stood in that same place at the edge of the world and had to decide, in the cold and the dark, what he truly valued. The Starks have ruled the North for approximately 8,000 years. This fact is stated so matter-of-factly in the world of Westeros that it tends to pass without much comment. It is simply one of the background assumptions of the story, a piece of context that the narrative establishes and then builds on without dwelling on it. But it deserves to be dwelt on. 8,000 years of continuous rule by a single family is not a number that has a real-world equivalent. The longest continuously ruling royal dynasties in actual human history span a few hundred years at most before a break of some kind. A conquest, a dynastic failure, an internal revolt, a name change interrupts the continuity. What the Starks claim, and what the evidence of Winterfell's foundations and the depth of the crypts beneath it seems to support, is something without genuine historical parallel. An unbroken bloodline in an unbroken seat of power for longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization. Let your body continue to rest, heavy and still. We are moving now into the question of what 8,000 years of family history actually looks like from the inside, what it does to a culture, to a way of seeing the world, to a family's sense of itself and its relationship to the land it inhabits. This is not a question that can be answered quickly, and I do not intend to rush through it. There is something here about the relationship between a people and a place that is one of the quietest and most important themes in the whole of A Song of Ice and Fire. And it comes into sharpest focus when you spend enough time with the Starks to understand that they do not simply live in the North. They are the North, in some sense, that goes beyond metaphor. The hot springs that run beneath Winterfell are among the most practically significant features of the castle, and they are among the features least discussed in the narrative, which is typical of Bran the Builder's genuine intelligence, which tends to reveal itself in practical details rather than in grand gestures. The hot springs keep Winterfell warm, even when the temperature outside is far below what would make any other castle habitable. They run through the walls, under the floors, creating a pervasive ambient warmth that makes Winterfell, uniquely among the great castles of Westeros, genuinely comfortable to inhabit in deep winter. Whether this was Bran the Builder's deliberate engineering, whether he understood thermal circulation and built to exploit it, or whether he simply had the wisdom to build on warm ground, the result is the same. A fortress that is heated by the earth itself, that does not require the constant cutting of wood and the burning of fuel that all other northern structures depend on. The builder made a castle that the winter could not defeat from the outside, because the winter had already been accounted for in the foundation. The crypts beneath Winterfell go deeper than any maester has fully mapped. This is one of the details that the story introduces quietly, and then refuses to fully resolve, which is characteristic of how Martin handles the deepest mysteries, not by hiding them exactly, but by surrounding them with so much ordinary detail that they almost disappear into the background until a careful reader notices that the crypt extends below the oldest mapped level, that there are passages that no living person knows the full length of, that the castle's underground architecture is more complex and more ancient than its above-ground architecture suggests. The dead kings of the north are laid to rest down there, in stone crypts along a great corridor that stretches into the dark, and each king has an iron sword laid across his lap. Why an iron sword? The official explanation is ceremonial, symbolic, the kind of thing cultures do to honor their rulers without necessarily remembering why. But the older explanation, the one that old Nan and the folk traditions of the North preserve, is more interesting. The swords are there to keep the dead from rising. Sit with that for a moment. The Starks have been placing iron swords across the laps of their dead kings since before the Andal invasion, since before the Long Night was a distant memory rather than a living wound. The practice predates the formal establishment of the Night's Watch. It predates almost everything in the story except the wall itself. And the people who began the practice believed it was necessary. They believed or feared or knew from direct experience that the dead kings of House Stark, the specifically and powerfully magical bloodline of Bran the Builder, a bloodline that carried greensight and warg ability in its marrow, might need to be prevented from returning after death. Not because the dead Stark kings would necessarily intend harm, but because a dead Stark king, with the power that runs in Stark blood, animated by whatever force animates the other's soldiers, would be a catastrophic thing in the crypts beneath Winterfell. The swords are a precaution. The precaution has been maintained for 8,000 years. The Godswood of Winterfell is a 3-acre space enclosed within the castle walls, left entirely wild, not tended, not manicured, not organized in any of the ways that castle gardens tend to be organized. It is a piece of ancient forest preserved inside a human fortress. And at its heart is the weirwood whose face has been watching everything that has happened in Winterfell for the entire span of the castle's existence. The tree is enormous, trunk wide as a man's arm span, roots that have worked their way through the castle's foundations over 8,000 years of growth. The face in its bark is the oldest face in Winterfell, older than any of the stones around it, older than any of the names on the memorial walls, older than any of the traditions that the Starks have maintained. Ned Stark prays before this face. He thinks before it. He makes his most serious decisions in its presence, not because he expects the tree to answer him in a way he can hear, but because in the presence of something that old and that watchful, the small self-deceptions that ordinary life runs on tend to become harder to maintain. The Stark words, "Winter is coming," have been analyzed and interpreted and cited so many times in discussions of the story that they have almost become cliché, which is a particular kind of irony for a phrase that contains a warning about the consequences of forgetting important things. But the phrase is worth approaching freshly, without the accumulated weight of its own fame, because what it actually says is much more interesting than what it tends to be understood as saying. It is not a threat. It is not a boast. It is a statement of fact that the Starks have been making for 8,000 years. And in 8,000 years of making it, they have sometimes been taken literally, as a prediction about the weather, and sometimes been taken politically, as a reminder that the North's challenges require constant vigilance, and sometimes in the deepest and most private Stark conversations that the story gives us access to, have been understood as something closer to a cosmological claim. The winter that is coming is not a season. It is the long night. It always has been. And it is always coming. Ned Stark is the Stark we know best, and he is in many ways the most purely traditional Stark the story gives us. A man who has absorbed the 8,000-year Stark ethos so completely that he cannot function outside it. His honor is not simply a personal virtue. It is the expression of a family culture that has been maintained without significant interruption for 8,000 years. a culture built around the specific demands of ruling a place where the winter can kill you, and the darkness beyond the wall is real, and the people who serve you deserve honesty about both of these facts. Ned's fatal flaw in King's Landing is that he imports a northern ethic into a southern political environment, where that ethic is not simply impractical, but actively dangerous. The South plays a different game. The South does not remember the long night in its bones. The South has had 8,000 years to forget what the North has spent 8,000 years keeping alive. Robb Stark's war is, at its heart, an attempt to restore the pre-Targaryen reality in which the North governed itself as a separate kingdom. This is not a revolutionary idea. It is the most conservative idea available to Robb, the idea that goes furthest back. Before Aegon's conquest, the North was its own kingdom. Before Aegon's conquest, the Starks were kings, not lords. Robb is not claiming something new. He is claiming something very, very old. Older than the Targaryens. Older than any of the southern dynasties that the Iron Throne was built to accommodate. Whether the idea is viable in the present is a different question. But the idea itself is not radical. The idea is 8,000 years of uninterrupted precedent. Arya Stark's return to Winterfell in the show, after everything she has been through, after everything that has been done to her, and everything she has done in return, is one of the story's most quietly powerful moments. She comes back to the castle her ancestor built, walks through the godswood that has been part of her family's world for 8,000 years, and stands for a moment in the ancient training yard where she first learned to shoot a bow. The Winterfell she returns to is changed, occupied, retaken, occupied again, scarred by everything that has been done within its walls. But the weirwood is still there. The hot springs are still warm. The deep foundations that Bran the Builder laid are still holding. The castle has survived everything that the past several years have thrown at it, as it has survived everything the past 8,000 years have thrown at it. The castle endures. The bloodline endures. The words endure. Sansa Stark, standing at the end of the show as Warden of an independent North, is completing something that Robb began, and that traces its logic all the way back to the original Stark Kingdom. She has learned, through the most painful and comprehensive education available to a person in Westeros, through Cersei and Littlefinger and Ramsay Bolton and everything they put her through, how the world actually works as opposed to how it is supposed to work. She has learned the Southern game without losing the Northern ethos. She has become, in a sense, the most fully realized Stark in the story. Someone who carries 8,000 years of family culture, and also understands clearly and without illusion the world she must navigate with that culture. She is what a survivor of everything looks like when they have not let the surviving unmake them. Bran Stark himself is the most mysterious of Ned's children in this regard, the one whose development leads somewhere that no previous Stark has gone. Into territory that the 8,000-year dynasty has been circling without quite arriving at. He falls from a tower. He is paralyzed. He crosses the wall. He sits with Bloodraven in the cave beneath the weirwood tree. He becomes the three-eyed raven. And then he becomes king. Not king in the north, not the continuator of the 8,000-year Stark tradition, but king of the Six Kingdoms, a new kind of ruler for a new kind of arrangement. He sits on no throne. He attends no feasts. He rolls away from the council chamber when the mundane business of governance begins, his attention elsewhere, his eyes somewhere the present cannot reach. He is the 8,000th year of the Stark line, doing something the first 1,000 years could not have imagined. The stark crypts hold the faces of all these kings, stone faces, serious and still, looking outward into the dark corridor beneath Winterfell, with the particular expression of the very long dead, which is not grief and not serenity, but something between the two that has no better name. Every face in that corridor is the face of someone who tried to be a Stark, in whatever the specific circumstances of their moment required. Some succeeded brilliantly, and some failed catastrophically, and most occupied the vast middle ground of ordinary human effort, doing what they could with what they had. In a place that demanded specific things of the people who lived there. The iron swords lie across their laps. The cold is kept at bay, barely, by the hot springs above. And the weirwood watches the courtyard where the newest Stark is learning to shoot, or practicing with a sword, or simply sitting in the snow with a direwolf, trying to understand what it means to carry 8,000 years of family in your blood. Let the crypts hold you now, gently, in their cold quiet, not the cold of the darkness beyond the wall, but the cold of stone and deep earth, which is a different kind of cold. Not hostile, not hungry, just old, just the temperature of things that have been underground for a very long time. The Starks sleep in that cold. Their iron swords rest across their hands. The weirwood watches above, and above the weirwood, the night sky of the north is dense with stars. More stars than you can count, more stars than any city sky will ever show. The full winter sky of a place far from any other light, enormous and cold and quietly overwhelming. Rest beneath those stars tonight. Let the Stark blood do its ancient work of remembering. You have carried enough today. Let the old family carry it for you now. Beneath Winterfell, deeper than the crypts, deeper than the hot springs, deeper than any maester has measured, there is something the weirwood tree has been watching since before the first stone of the castle was laid. And the answer to what the trees have seen, preserved in root and sap, and the slow current of ancient memory, is the most powerful thing in Westeros. The trees remember. Not in the way that a person remembers, with the soft editorial processes that make human memory so unreliable and so strangely beautiful. The selective forgetting, the unconscious rearrangement, the way events are recolored by who you have become since they happened. The weirwood trees remember the way that stone remembers pressure, or the way that ice remembers the shape of whatever formed it. They record rather than recall. They preserve rather than interpret. Every event that has occurred in the presence of a weirwood face, every prayer spoken before one, every oath made, every act of violence or tenderness or ordinary daily existence that played out within their watching range, is present in the wood, layered in the heartwood rings, accessible to anyone with the ability to reach in and find it. Let that settle over you like a blanket. The weirwood trees have been recording the world since before the first men arrived, since before the Pact, since before any human concept of time existed in Westeros. Whatever the children of the forest understood about the nature of consciousness and memory, they built that understanding into trees that do not rot and do not die. Trees whose heartwood, removed from the bark, does not decay even after centuries outside the living tree. As though the biological processes that normally dissolve organic matter simply do not apply. The weirwood network is not merely old. It is, in a specific and important sense, outside time, operating by different rules than the rest of the organic world, preserving what everything else loses, holding what the centuries erode. Bloodraven is the most recent human being to hold the role of Three-Eyed Raven before Bran Stark, and he is worth understanding because he is the bridge between the deep past and the present of the main story. His full name is Brynden Rivers, He was a Targaryen bastard, pale-skinned and red-eyed, with a great wine-stained birthmark across half his face. A skilled and unsentimental master of spies who served under King Aerys I, and then King Maekar, before disappearing north of the Wall with a ranging party of the Night's Watch. He had the green sight. The Targaryen blood carries its own faint thread of the old magical sensitivity, diluted from the original Dragonlord strain, and when he went north, he eventually found his way to the cave beneath the great weirwood tree, where the previous three-eyed raven had waited for him. He has been there for over 100 years when Bran Stark arrives. In the cave, Bloodraven is barely distinguishable from the tree. His legs have merged with the roots. His arms are wrapped in bark. His eyes are open and white and seeing something that is not the dim interior of the cave, but the entire accumulated vision of the weirwood network. Every weirwood in every godswood in the north, every carved face on every pale trunk, every moment preserved in every tree since the children first began their watching. He has been in this state for over a century. He does not eat. He does not sleep in any ordinary sense. He is being slowly absorbed into the tree, the way a stone left too long in a river is slowly worn away by the water, not destroyed but transformed, the boundary between him and the living wood becoming less distinct with every passing year. What Bloodraven, what the three-eyed raven, sees through the network is not selective. This is the quality of the weirwood memory that is most important to understand and most difficult to fully reckon with. It does not edit. The human memory edits constantly, reflexively, without awareness of the edits it is making. The weirwood memory does none of this. Everything is there. Every moment of grief and hope and boredom and cruelty and kindness and catastrophe that has occurred before a weirwood face since the tree was first old enough to carry a carved face. The three-eyed raven can look into any of it. But the looking is not simple. The amount of information in the network is so vast, so unmediated, so without the usual shortcuts that allow a human mind to navigate time without drowning in it, that the greenseer must learn a specific discipline of attention, must learn to look for what they need without being consumed by everything else that is equally present. Bran Stark arrives in the cave as a boy, and the education he receives there is in many ways the opposite of what education normally is. He is not being taught to acquire knowledge. He has access to all knowledge, more knowledge than any human mind could process in 1,000 lifetimes. He is being taught to navigate, to choose, to find the specific thing he needs to see within the infinite archive of what is there. This is a discipline that sounds simple, and is perhaps the most difficult thing available to human consciousness. The discipline of selective attention in the presence of absolute information. Most of us have only fragmentary attention in the presence of fragmentary information, and even that is difficult to manage. The three-eyed raven must maintain discipline in the face of everything. The visions that Bran experiences through the network in the show include several that are central to the story's deepest revelations. He sees his father in the Tower of Joy, a vision that confirms what the reader has long suspected, that Lyanna Stark did not die in the tower because she was held prisoner, but because she died giving birth to a baby whose existence had to be concealed from everyone who might want to use it or destroy it. He sees Jon Snow's parentage before anyone else in the living world does. He sees the Night King creating the first White Walker by driving dragonglass into the heart of a first man bound to a weirwood tree, a moment of creation that is also a moment of violation. A perversion of the weirwood's nature as a vessel of memory and life, turned by the children's desperation into a vessel of death. The tree that witnessed the creation is the same kind of tree that the three-eyed raven sits in, centuries and thousands of years later. The network holds that memory too. The Weirwood network's nature as a surveillance system built into the great fortresses of the north is one of the story's quietly radical implications. Every castle of significance in the north has a godswood. Every godswood has a weirwood. And every weirwood is part of the network. This means that for as long as the network has been operational, which is to say, for as long as the weirwood trees have been alive, which is to say, for the entire span of recorded and unrecorded Westerosi history, everything that has happened in the godswoods of the north has been preserved. Ned Stark's prayers are in there. The prayers of all his ancestors are in there. The conversations that were had in those godswoods, the decisions that were made, the moments of personal history that were never formally recorded anywhere. They are in the heartwood of the trees, visible to anyone with the ability to access the network. Privacy, in the presence of a weirwood, is an illusion. This raises a question that the story plants very carefully and then does not fully answer. Did Bran the Builder know this when he built? When he constructed the first godswood of Winterfell and placed the weirwood at its centre? When he wove the old magic of the children into the foundations of his wall and his castle? Was he deliberately building a monitoring system into the architecture of his world? Was Winterfell designed from the beginning to be a place that remembered? If so, then Bran the Builder was not simply a civil engineer of extraordinary ability. He was the architect of an information system that operated for 8,000 years without anyone quite understanding what it was. A system of total recall embedded in living wood, managed by the trees themselves. Accessible only to those rare individuals with the blood sensitivity to reach into it. The castle as library, the godswood as the reading room, the weirwood face as the interface. The children of the forest, when they placed the faces in the weirwood trees, were doing something that had implications they understood far better than the humans who adopted the practice afterward. The Pact preserved the trees. The humans who made the Pact were committing, without quite knowing it, to the permanent maintenance of a recording system for all their future history. Every generation of Starks that prayed before the Winterfell weirwood was adding their prayers to the archive. Every generation of Northern Lords who maintained their godswoods and treated the weirwood faces with reverence were, in effect, keeping the network operational, keeping the recording going, ensuring that the archive accumulated. The old gods received their prayers, but what the prayers left behind in the wood was not faith returned upward into the divine. It was memory, retained downward into the earth. What Bran Stark does with the network, as he grows into the full capacity of the three-eyed raven, is something that was always theoretically possible, but had never been fully realized by any previous occupant of the role. He does not merely look into the past. He begins, tentatively and with enormous caution, to interact with it, to reach backward through the network and make contact with specific moments, to call to people who are in those moments and who can, under certain circumstances, hear him. The most disturbing instance of this is the vision of the young Ned Stark in the Tower of Joy, in which Ned turns at the sound of his name and looks toward a sound that has no source he can identify in his own present. Whether Bran was truly present in that moment, or whether he was experiencing a recording that included a ghost of his own future presence, is a question the story leaves open. But the possibility that the watcher can affect what he watches, that the network is not merely an archive, but a conversation, this is the most unsettling implication of everything the weirwood magic represents. The three-eyed raven tells Bran, early in their time together in the cave, that he will never walk again, but he will fly. This is an accurate description of what happens. Bran's body remains in the cave, in the wheelchair, in the godswood. His consciousness flies through the weirwood network, through the bodies of ravens, through the accumulated vision of thousands of years of careful watching. He becomes, in a very real sense, the memory of the world. Not the world's king, not its general, not its greatest warrior or wisest counselor, but its memory. The thing that holds what would otherwise be lost. The function that the weirwood trees have been performing since before the long night, now instantiated in a human being, the most powerful and most overlooked figure in a world of people fighting over thrones. The power of memory is not the power that the world of Westeros has generally valued. The world of Westeros has valued the power of armies, of gold, of political alliance, of fear. It has occasionally valued wisdom and counsel. It has rarely valued simple remembering, the act of holding in mind what has happened and what it meant and what it implies for what will come. But Bran, as the three-eyed raven, embodies the argument that memory is the foundational power, that all the armies and all of the gold and all of the political maneuvering is downstream of the question of what is remembered and what is forgotten, and who gets to decide which is which. The weirwood network has been making that argument for 12,000 years. In Bran Stark, it finally has a voice that can speak it in the language of the present. Let the network move through you now, its roots going down past any depth you can consciously reach, its branches connecting the godswoods of the north in a system older than the castles they grow within. The trees are watching. They have always been watching. Everything that has mattered in Westeros has happened within their sight, and they have held it all, root to root, heartwood to heartwood, through every winter the world has seen since the first children pressed the first face into the first pale bark, and the first watching began. There is a great comfort in being witnessed, if you can accept it. In being seen by something that does not judge, does not forget, does not impose its own emotional needs on what it observes. The trees simply watch, and remember, tonight they are watching you rest. Your breathing is very slow and very even. The deep root quiet of the weirwood network is all around you, beneath you, part of the earth that holds the building you rest inside. Nothing has been lost. Nothing is truly gone. The network holds it all, every moment you have lived, in its own way, in the accumulated memory of a world that has been paying attention since before you were born. Let that be a comfort, rather than a burden tonight. Let the watching be gentle. Let the roots hold you, and let whatever is left of the day dissolve into the deep quiet of 12,000 years of careful remembering, 12,000 years of watching, a generation of darkness, a wall of ice and ancient faith, a bloodline of builders. And at the very end of all that history, a boy sits in a godswood with his eyes rolled white and his mind reaching backward through time, toward the very beginning, toward a man named Bran, who once looked at the end of the world and asked a simple, extraordinary question: what can I build here? We have travelled 12,000 years tonight. From the oldest forests to the last throne, from the first carved weirwood face to the three-eyed raven who sits in the roots of an ancient tree and sees everything those faces have ever seen. And at both ends of that journey, at the very beginning and very nearly at the end, there is a Bran. The repetition of the name is not accidental. In a world where names carry weight, where the old gods are named in the same breath as the trees that hold their faces, where the oath of the Night's Watch names the darkness and the fire, and the walls and the dawn, the return of the name Bran at the conclusion of the story is a structural decision, as deliberate as any of Bran the Builder's architectural ones. The wheel has turned. The name has come home. Let your breathing be very slow now. Let your body be as heavy and as still as it has been all night. We are arriving at the end of something, not the end of the story, which continues in ways the show has suggested and the books will eventually fully reveal, but the end of this particular strand of the story, the 12,000-year strand that began with a man who built and has arrived at a boy who sees. The closing is not triumphant. It is not the brassy resolution of a story that has answered all its questions and tied all its threads. It is something quieter than that. And perhaps more honest, the closing of a long arc, the way a river closes when it reaches the sea, not with a crash but with a widening, a dissolution, a becoming something larger than what it was before. Consider what Bran the Builder and Bran Stark have in common. Both are associated with a kind of perception that goes beyond ordinary human sight. The Builder's possible green sight, his ability to work with the children in ways that required an understanding of the Weirwood network's deep structure, his design of buildings that incorporated living memory into their foundations. All of this suggests someone who saw the world differently from the people around him, someone for whom the boundary between the physical and the magical was more permeable than it was for others. Bran Stark, explicitly and undeniably, has this same quality amplified to its maximum expression. He can see everything the network has ever seen. He can look at a person and know their history before they speak. He can look at the present and understand its origins in a past 12,000 years deep. Both Brans see further than ordinary men. Both of them build with what they see. Bran the Builder built with stone and ice and magic and the help of giants and children. Bran Stark builds with memory and prophecy and the long view of history, with the ability to see consequences before they arrive, to understand where things are heading because he can see where they have been. His kingship, such as it is, operates on the same principle as the Builder's Wall. It is designed not for the short term, but for the long one. He tells the small council that he knows where Drogon has gone, which is to say, he knows where the last dragon is, what it is doing, what the future of dragonkind in Westeros will be. He says it with a calm that looks, from the outside, like indifference, but is actually the calm of someone who has so much information that urgency has become a much smaller category than it is for people with less. Bran the Builder raised the wall because he could see the threat. Bran the Three-Eyed Raven governs the kingdom because he can see the next 10 threats, and the 10 after that, and the pattern that connects them all. The wheel is the metaphor that Daenerys Targaryen uses when she describes what she intends to do with Westeros. She wants to break the wheel, she says, the wheel of great families crushing everyone beneath them in their endless cycle of rising and falling and rising again. It is a magnificent ambition, and a genuinely revolutionary one, and the story watches it fail, not because Daenerys is wrong about the wheel or wrong about what it does to the people it crushes, but because the wheel is not the kind of thing that one person's vision and one person's fire can break. The wheel is structural. It is built into the nature of power in this world, has been built into it since the first men organized themselves into the first of the 12 kingdoms, and the first king decided that his son would be the next king. To break the wheel would require changing not just who sits at the center of it, but the nature of how the center works. What Bran Stark offers, in the final arrangement of the show, is not a broken wheel, but a different axis. He does not eliminate hereditary rule. Sansa rules an independent North as the heir of 8,000 years of Stark tradition. He does not eliminate the great families. The Lannisters, the Tullys, the remaining houses all continue. He does not eliminate the dynamics that create the wheel's destructive cycling. What he does is sit at the center of those dynamics with a kind of consciousness that is not invested in them, that does not need from them what previous rulers have needed, that can observe them without being captured by them. He is not a better player of the game that Cersei and Littlefinger and Tywin Lannister all played. He is a different kind of presence entirely, one that the game does not know how to assimilate, because the game was designed for people who want things. And Bran, in the deepest and most disorienting way, may no longer want anything in the ordinary sense of the word. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it is one of the most genuinely strange and interesting conclusions available to this story. The person who wins the Game of Thrones, who ends up on the throne, or in the position of the throne, in the small council chamber at King's Landing, is the one character in the entire story who appears to have stopped wanting. Every other major character is defined by desire. The desire for power, for justice, for revenge, for love, for recognition, for the restoration of something lost. These desires drive the plot. They create the conflicts that produce the story. And then the person who ends up with the institutional authority is the one who no longer has any of that. He wanted to walk again once. He wanted his family back once. He wanted the ordinary things that ordinary boys want. All of that has been superseded by something too large for personal desire, by the consciousness that holds 12,000 years of human wanting, and has moved past wanting into simply knowing. The Stark motto acquires its full meaning at this moment, its deepest, oldest, most precisely accurate meaning. Winter is coming. It has always been coming. The long night happened once, and it established a pattern, and the pattern has been repeating ever since in smaller and smaller echoes. Each generation's version of the dark, each generation's version of the cold, that no fire seems quite sufficient to hold back. The wall was the answer to the first long night. What is the answer to the next one? The show suggests imperfectly that Bran Stark is the answer, or rather, that what Bran Stark represents is the answer. Memory. Not military power, not dragonfire, not clever political maneuvering, but the stubborn, patient, unglamorous work of remembering what happened, why it happened, what it cost, and what was built in response to it. So that the next time the cold comes, the world is not starting from nothing, but from the knowledge of what 12,000 years of human experience has taught. George R.R. Martin has said, in various interviews over the years, that the central question of his work is the relationship between the individual and history, between the person who is swept up in events and the events that are larger than any person, between the choices that individuals make and the structural forces that shape the context in which those choices are made. A Song of Ice and Fire is, from this perspective, not primarily a story about dragons or dynasties or the fight for a throne. It is a meditation on the question of whether human beings are capable of learning from their history, or whether the cycle simply continues regardless. The wheel turning, the long night coming, the wall rising and falling and needing to be raised again. Bran Stark as king is Martin's most direct engagement with that question. The answer the story offers is tentative and conditional. Maybe. If the memory is preserved, if the pattern is understood, if someone sits in the center of things who can see the full arc of 12,000 years, and use that seeing to make different choices than the ones that keep leading back to the same catastrophes. The boy who fell from the window. The boy who could not walk but learned to fly. The boy who became the memory of the world. And then, improbably, the ruler of a part of it. He rolls away from the small council at the end of the show, and nobody quite knows where he goes when he does that. Whether he is visiting the Weirwood network, watching something happening on the other side of the world, or simply sitting in the large quiet of a consciousness that has absorbed 12,000 years of history and needs occasionally, a moment away from the noisy immediacy of the present. He built something in the end, not with stone and ice, but with the patience to be what the world needed him to be, which was the thing it had always needed and never quite had. A witness who remembered. Bran the Builder raised the wall so that something could survive. Bran the Three-Eyed Raven became the memory of what survived, so that the wall, or whatever the next wall is, the next great answer to the next great darkness, could be built with the knowledge of what came before. The first Bran built in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, when the world was still raw and the long night was a recent wound. The last Bran builds in the accumulating knowledge of 12,000 years of subsequent history, with access to everything that was tried and everything that failed and everything that held. He builds differently, more carefully, with less urgency and more understanding. Perhaps that is what 12,000 years of history is for, not to be carried as a burden, but to be used as a foundation, the way Bran the Builder used the hot springs of Winterfell, not fighting the nature of the ground, but building in conversation with it, letting the earth's deep warmth become the castle's warmth, letting the land's oldest quality become the fortress's greatest strength. Daenerys could not break the wheel. Jon Snow could not lead the world through the darkness by the force of his own honor. Tyrion could not think his way around the structural problems of power. Cersei could not hold the world through control and fear. Sansa could survive the wheel, and she did, and she will continue to. But only Bran can see the wheel from outside, can hold in his expanding consciousness the entire span of the wheel's history. From the first king who decided his blood was more important than his people's welfare, to the last act of every subsequent ruler who made the same decision for the same reasons, and offer the alternative not as an ideology to be imposed, but as a demonstrated fact about what the world is and how it works and what it has always needed. The wheel does not break. But perhaps with someone sitting at its center who has seen every turn it has ever made, it begins to slow. We have been traveling for a long time tonight. 12,000 years in the length of the story, and however many hours it has been for your body, resting here in this particular room, in this particular night, in this particular point in your own history, which is smaller than the history we have explored, but is nonetheless yours, and therefore matters enormously. You have been through the forests of the children, through the wars of the first men, through the long night, and the forging of Lightbringer, and the raising of the wall. You have walked in the shadow of Bran the Builder, and sat in the roots of the Three-Eyed Raven's tree. You have traced the line that connects the first Bran to the last, the beginning of the story to its most recent conclusion. And you have done all of this while your body rested, which is the particular miracle of this kind of telling, that the mind can travel 12,000 years, while the body stays exactly where it is, warm and still and undisturbed. The wall stands in your memory now, perhaps the most vivid it has ever stood, now that you know something of who built it and why, now that you have felt the weight of what it was built to answer. Winterfell stands, the weirwood watches, the hot springs run their slow course through stone walls that have endured 8,000 years of everything the North could bring against them. The weirwood network holds its accumulation of witnessed moments in living wood that does not rot. And somewhere in that network, the memory of the first Bran the Builder is present, not named, not clearly legible in the way that later memories are, but there in the oldest layers. In the heartwood that was already old when the wall was new, in the first ring of the first tree that watched the first castle go up over the first hot spring in the north, in the very beginning of everything this story has been telling. The stories will be here when you wake. The history will keep. Every word spoken tonight about 12,000 years of Westerosi history will rest in you the way the weirwood trees rest in their soil, not urgently, not demanding to be processed or organized or turned into useful conclusions, just present, settled, part of the ground you stand on when you open your eyes in the morning. Let that be enough. Let the deep roots do their quiet work in the dark while you sleep. Your breathing is barely audible now. The weight of your body against the surface beneath you is complete and comfortable. There is nothing pressing at the edge of this moment. No obligations, no concerns, no unfinished questions that cannot wait for morning. The oldest forest in the world is very far away, and also, in the sense that matters tonight, very close, present in every piece of wood in this room, in the distant tree outside the nearest window, in the persistent fact of a world that has been growing and watching and remembering since long before you arrived in it and will continue long after. You are a small, warm point in an immeasurably old world, and tonight the old world is holding you. The first Bran built something meant to outlast everything. It has. And now your watch is ended. Sleep. If the history we have explored together tonight has helped quiet your mind, we would be grateful if you subscribed. New stories are always waiting, as old as these ones and as far from the ordinary world as the wall is from the warmth you feel right now. Subscribe, and we will be here when you return. If you enjoyed this journey, let me know where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if there is a corner of Westerosi history, or Age of Heroes lore that you would like to explore in a future story, leave it in the comments below. The library of the past is very large. We have barely begun.